68 women lay in rows on the floor of a grave at Ur, dressed for a festival that never happened. Gold ribbons in their hair, headdresses of lapis and carnelian, a cup of copper or silver beside almost every hand. 6 armed men guarded the ramp above them. 74 bodies counted and catalogued in one pit cut into the ground about 4,500 years ago. The man who found them said they walked down willingly, drank from the cups, and fell asleep forever. For 80 years, that was the story. Then a hospital scanner looked inside one of their skulls. What it found does not match a peaceful sleep, and it forces a question the excavation never answered. Not how they died, what they were told before they lay down. Let me show you the floor first, because the floor is the whole case. When Leonard Woolley opened this grave in the late 1920s, he did not find scattered bones. He found order. Bodies arranged in careful rows in the corner of the pit, most of them women, most of them young, all of them in court dress. Not everyday clothing, their finest. Ribbons of gold wound through their hair, and where the gold ran out, silver. Beads of lapis lazuli hauled across mountains, from what is now Afghanistan. Headbands, earrings the size of a modern hoop, cloaks sewn with hundreds of tiny beads. These were people dressed to be seen, and then placed on the ground and covered with earth. Near the entrance ramp lay 6 men with weapons and the remains of helmets. Guards, facing the way in. Against the far wall, the crushed frames of lyres, and beside them the bones of the people who had played them. One great copper basin that may have been a drum. This was not a random killing, it was a composition. Somebody arranged this. Understand what recovering it involved. Woolley was not lifting clean skeletons off a shelf. He was digging meters down through the collapsed fill of a pit, into a layer where the bone had gone soft and the ornaments had slipped out of place as the flesh beneath them rotted and the earth pressed down. His team poured wax and plaster over the ground to lift whole clusters intact, because a headdress touched with a trowel would simply fall apart into loose beads. That is how carefully this was excavated, and it is why the arrangement can be trusted. The rows are not an accident of collapse. They were recorded, cluster by cluster, exactly where the bodies had been set down. Woolley labeled the grave PG 1237 and gave it a name that has stuck ever since: the Great Death Pit. And here is the first thing that should bother you. Grand as that name sounds, this is not written like a legend. It reads like an inventory. Count them: 74 bodies, 6 men, 68 women. 28 of the women wore ribbons of gold, the rest silver, a distinction someone recorded, someone maintained. Positions logged, objects logged. When Woolley's team drew this pit, they produced something closer to a manifest than a myth. A list of who was placed where, in what order, wearing what rank. And a manifest implies a hand that made it. Someone stood at the edge of this pit and decided the sequence. And this was not the only one. A short distance away lay another grave, PG 789. With its own crowd of attendants, dozens more bodies, more guards, more musicians, laid out the same way. Whatever happened in the Great Death Pit was not a single act of grief by one unlucky household. It was a form, a repeated procedure the people of Ur knew how to carry out, more than once, with the same categories of people filling the same roles. You do not repeat a metaphor, you repeat a practice. And here is the detail that turns the whole grave colder. We do not know who they died for. A death pit like this existed to serve a tomb, a stone chamber holding the body of a king or queen, the person the whole procession followed into the ground. In some of the graves at Ur, that chamber survived, and Woolley could name the owner. In the Great Death Pit, the central chamber had already been robbed in antiquity, its principal burial disturbed and gone. So the ruler at the center of it, the one these 68 women were dressed and killed to accompany, has no name, no body, nothing left. The attendants are still here. The person they were placed around is not. The grandest grave in the cemetery is missing the only individual it was built for. So the obvious question is the one that Clay refuses to answer. Where are the instructions? Because here is what Woolley did not find. He did not find a tablet in that pit explaining it. No inscription reading, "This is why." No text saying what these women were promised or threatened with or told. He pulled 68 bodies out of the ground in full ceremonial dress, and there was no caption. The most organized mass death in the early ancient world, and the people who staged it left the one document you would most want to read blank. That silence is not comfortable. It sits over the whole grave. There is one thin exception, and it only sharpens the silence. A handful of the dead carried cylinder seals, the little engraved stones that acted as a personal signature. Most of the 68 carried nothing to identify them at all. But one seal, found in this cemetery with a man who served as a groom, was cut with a name, Lugal Sapada. Out of an entire crowd of the arranged dead, a single name survives, and it belongs to a servant. Everyone else in that pit went into the ground anonymous. 68 women in gold, and we cannot say what a single one of them was called. And that forces us out of the pit, toward the only Sumerian text that describes anything like this happening. It is called the Death of Gilgamesh, not the famous epic of the flood and the search for eternal life. A separate, older Sumerian poem, pieced together from clay tablets found at Nippur and at a site called Turan. And buried inside it is a passage that stops you cold once you have seen the pit. It describes the death of the king, and then it starts listing who goes with him. Listen to the order: his beloved wife, his beloved son, his beloved junior wife, his musician, his cupbearer, his barber, his palace retainers, his servants, his beloved objects. All of them, the poem says, were laid down in their places. Laid down in their places. Read that again, because the safe reading and the disturbing reading fork right there. The safe reading says this is poetry. A grieving image of a great man taking his whole world into the afterlife. The way we might say someone was buried with his memories. Symbolic. A metaphor for loss. And for a long time, that is exactly how these lines were treated. A story, a beautiful, sad story about a legendary king, but look at the wording again with the pit still in your mind. This is not how grief usually talks. Grief does not itemize. This poem does not say the king was mourned by his household. It names them by function: the musician, the cupbearer, the barber. It sorts them into ranks the way Woolley sorted gold ribbons from silver. It reads less like a lament and more like a placement order, a staffing chart for a grave. Why would a poem about death bother to name the barber? You do not put the barber in a metaphor. You put the barber in an inventory. And that is the exact moment the two things stop feeling like separate objects, a poem in a museum drawer, a pit under the desert, and start feeling like two copies of the same document. One written on clay, one written in bodies. I want to be honest about how fragile the poem is, because that matters. The Death of Gilgamesh does not survive complete. It comes to us broken, in more than one version, and the two main copies from Nippur and Turan do not match line for line. Translators fill gaps. Some of the words are uncertain. So no, this is not a signed confession. But the passage naming the household is one of the parts that does survive, in more than one copy, and it says the same unsettling thing each time. The people around the king are placed with him, by roll, in order. The clay is damaged. That specific list is not. So let us slow down and be fair to the man who dug the grave, because his explanation was not stupid. It was merciful. Woolley looked at those 68 women, laid out so neatly, showing no obvious signs of struggle, each with a small cup near her hand. And he built a picture that let everyone sleep at night. They walked down into the pit alive, he said, in their finest clothes, in procession, the musicians still playing. Each carried a cup. In the cup was a drug, or a poison, something to send them under. They drank, they lay down in their rows, the music stopped, and then the pit was filled in over bodies that had simply gone to sleep. Willingly, an honor, not a murder. It is a powerful image. It held for 80 years. And the cup is the reason it held, because the cup makes it gentle. The cup turns a mass grave into a ritual of devotion. Take the cup away and you are left staring at 68 dead women and no explanation for how they got that way. So everything depends on the cup. And in 2007, somebody finally tested it. Researchers at the Penn Museum in Philadelphia took 2 skulls from this cemetery, real skulls, kept since Woolley's dig, and drove them to the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, not a lab bench, a hospital. The same CT scanner that images living patients was pointed at 2 people who died around 2450 BC. One was a young woman, catalogued as Body 52, in her late teens or very early 20s. The other, Body 50, a man in his mid to late 20s, a soldier. They were looking for the poison. What they found was a hole. In the vault of the skull, a clean perimortem fracture, an injury inflicted right around the moment of death. A roughly circular hole, about 30 millimeters across, and from the shape of it, the team could describe the weapon. Not a fall, not a crush from the collapsing grave. A hafted instrument with a small, pointed striking end, something like a copper battle axe with a spike, swung hard, into the back and side of the head. Sit with that measurement, 30 millimeters. 3 centimeters of caved-in bone in the skull of a girl barely out of her teens, wearing gold in her hair. That is not a poison cup. That is a blow, delivered by someone standing behind her. The gentle story does not survive that hole, and the scanner was not finished, because the same scans showed something else that the poison theory never predicted. The bone at the surface of the skull looked delaminated in places, peeling, layered, the way bone behaves when it has been exposed to heat. And inside the bone, tiny, dense specks that lit up on the scan, metallic. When they were analyzed, the reading pointed to mercury sulfide, cinnabar, a known preservative, heat, and mercury on the bodies of women Woolley thought were simply put to sleep. And cinnabar is not something you find lying around Ur. It is a specific mineral, bright red, that had to be sourced and carried in, the same way the lapis in their hair came from far away. Somebody decided these bodies were worth that material. Somebody spent it on corpses. You do not import a preservative to bury a body you are about to cover with dirt within the hour. You import it because you need the body to last. Now think about what that combination means, because it rewrites the entire scene. If these bodies were heated and treated with a preservative to slow decay, then they were not killed and immediately buried. They were killed and then kept, prepared, preserved so they would not rot, because something was going to be done with them, over time, in the open, where decay would show. This was not a quiet drink and a covering of earth. This was a production. The current reading, built from those scans, runs like this. The attendants were killed by a blow to the head. Their bodies were then heated and embalmed to hold them. Then they were dressed, or redressed, in that court finery, and arranged, composed into rows, laid down in their places. A funeral that may have taken days, staged around bodies that had been struck, baked, and posed. The rows you are picturing were not 68 women falling asleep together. They were 68 bodies, arranged by hand, after death, to look like a court. Think about the number of hands that took: someone to strike them, someone to heat and treat the bodies, someone to dress them, set the ribbons, close the fingers around the cups, someone to lower them one after another into their assigned rows while the ones still alive waited their turn at the top of the ramp. This was not a moment, it was work. Organized, scheduled, staffed work, carried out on living people and then on their bodies. And that pulls us straight back to the poem and to the phrase, with all its comfort drained out, laid down in their places. That is not the language of people lying down on their own. It is the language of people being laid down, placed, by someone else. The Sumerian line and the forensic scan are now saying the same thing in 2 different alphabets, which leaves the hardest word in the whole title still standing there, unaddressed: willingly. Here is what you have to understand. Willingly was never on the clay. Willingly is Woolley's word. He looked at the order, the fine dress, the cups, and he inferred devotion that these people chose this, that it was a privilege to follow their ruler down. It is a natural human guess. It might even be partly true. Some of them may have believed completely that lying down in that pit bought them a place at the king's side forever. We cannot get inside a mind that stopped 4,500 years ago. And a person can walk toward a death they believe is holy and still be terrified at the edge of it. Belief and willingness are not the same thing. But look at what is actually in the grave, and the willingness gets harder to hold. 6 armed men at the entrance, facing in. If everyone came gladly, why post guards, and why aim them at the crowd rather than the door? A spiked weapon that matches a hole in a girl's skull. A preservative that says the killing came first and the arranging came after. None of that is the archaeology of volunteers. It is the archaeology of a rite that did not depend on consent, a rite that could produce the same neat rows whether the woman walked down or was carried. So what were they told before they lay down? That is the question the title promises, and the honest answer is the unsettling one. No tablet from Ur records it. Nobody wrote down the speech, the promise, the threat, the prayer, whatever it was that moved 68 women into that pit. The one document that would explain the Great Death Pit is the one document the people who built it did not leave, or did not survive. And that is where I have to be careful with you, because this is a case built on a small sample. 2 skulls were scanned, not 74. We cannot claim every one of those 68 women took a spike to the head. Some may still have gone under by the cup, exactly as Woolley thought. The staged funeral picture, the days-long display, is a reconstruction from real evidence, but it is still a reconstruction, and serious scholars still argue over how much of the pit it explains. This does not prove that not one of those women chose her place, but it does dismantle the thing that made the story bearable. The clean version walk in, drink, sleep, willingly cannot survive a 30-millimeter hole and a body full of mercury. Whatever happened at the edge of that pit was more physical, more controlled, and more violent than 80 years of textbooks let us believe. And the poem, read one last time, stops sounding like a lament at all. His musician, his cupbearer, his barber, his retainers, laid down in their places. It is a list of staff being retired into a grave. The oldest surviving text about a Mesopotamian ruler's death does not describe mourning. It describes a household being placed, function by function. Exactly like the manifest Woolley drew of the pit. We were handed two objects and told they were unrelated. A sad old Sumerian poem in a display case. A tidy archaeological label, Great Death Pit, PG 1237, on a grave full of jewelry. And for 80 years the arrangement was comfortable. The poem was metaphor. The pit was devotion, the cup was mercy. Then a scanner found the hole, and the mercury, and the heat, and the comfortable arrangement came apart. The poem was not softening the truth, it was recording the procedure. The pit was not devotion, it was staging. And the cup, the small copper cup that carried the whole gentle story, sits there beside a hand that belonged to a girl with 3 centimeters of her skull driven in. The clay never told us they were willing. It only told us they were placed. The word willingly, the whole comforting frame, we added ourselves because 68 dressed and murdered women are easier to look at if you decide they wanted to be there. Go back to the floor of the pit one more time. The rows, the gold ribbons and the silver ribbons, sorted by rank, the liars against the wall and the players beside them. The 6 guards at the ramp, facing in. And by almost every hand, that small cup empty now, catalogued, harmless behind glass. It was supposed to be the proof that this was gentle. It is the last thing they were given before they lay down. And it is still the only thing in that grave that ever promised these women a peaceful death. Everything else in the pit says otherwise. And the scribe who could have told us what they were promised left that tablet blank.